At 2:45 a.m., the illusion of Russian invincibility didn't just crack, it vaporized in an $80-foot tower of fire. For 3 days, Moscow believed they had broken Ukraine's energy backbone. But in a single, terrifying instant, a live feed reached an operations desk that turned generals pale. A $200 million substation in Belgorod, a fortress designed to withstand nuclear fallout, was being shredded by a swarm of drones that cost less than a used Toyota Camry. The shock wasn't just the explosion, it was the impossibility of it. How could cheap, garage-built drones with a maximum range of 10 miles suddenly appear 186 miles deep inside Russia's most heavily defended airspace? The answer wasn't a new missile or a secret NATO jet. It was a masterclass in deception that started with 3 humble logging trucks and ended with a Ukrainian AI weaponizing the wind itself. Ukraine didn't just blow up a power plant, they dismantled the physics of modern defense. They used thermal blankets to blind satellites, 12-volt heaters to fool attack helicopters, and the freezing winter air to turn steel pylons into shattering glass. This is the story of how the underdog turned the environment into the ultimate weapon. What aspect of this operation do you find most genius? The logging truck disguise, the wind-riding AI, or the thermal decoys? Comment 1 below. The silence that followed the explosion in Belgorod was not the peace of victory. It was the chilling, metallic silence of an equation solved too late. For 3 days, the Russian military had reveled in their crippling offensive, claiming to have kneecapped 14% of Ukraine's power grid. They had drawn a line in the snow, a hard boundary they believed defined their strategic depth. But at 2:45 a.m., that line dissolved in a tower of fire. The $200 million substation vaporized, and the horrifying truth dawned on a Moscow operations desk. They had been beaten not by cruise missiles, but by a swarm of Ukrainian drones, none of which cost more than a Toyota Camry. This was the moment the old doctrine died, choked by its own hubris. The shock was not merely the scale of the destruction, that was quantifiable, but the terrifying implication. A system designed to withstand missiles, sabotage, and the overwhelming weight of conventional warfare was being methodically disassembled by machines built in a garage, resembling racing quadcopters more than instruments of war. The question that chilled the marrow of every general was simple, yet strategically apocalyptic. How could drones with a meager 10-mile operational range suddenly appear 186 miles deep inside Russia's most protected, most sensitive airspace? The answer was a masterclass in modern deception, a chilling narrative that required rewinding just 15 minutes. The stage was set at 2:30 a.m. on the 17th of November, along rural forest roads where 3 logging trucks made their final, silent approach. To the casual eye, and certainly to the bored passing patrols, they were nothing more than the ordinary ebb and flow of the night shift, their beds laden with 3 tons of real timber, their plates registered locally. Yet, beneath that lumber were the weapons that would, in the freezing hours to come, rewrite the fundamental rules of modern warfare. Each truck was a covert mobile drone launch system, shielded under canvas and wrapped in a specialized thermal blanket. A silent, chilling innovation that suppressed the engine's heat signature to the point of near invisibility against the icy terrain. This wasn't guesswork. It was the output of pure computational malice. For 48 hours preceding the strike, a Ukrainian AI combat planner had been running endless, iterative simulations. It consumed Maxar satellite imagery, analyzed granular terrain contours, calculated the precise drift caused by 15 mm/h crosswinds, and mapped the curvature of every valley and the silhouette of every tree line. The resulting flight path was a calculated act of strategic arrogance, keeping the drones precisely at a 50-foot altitude, low enough to vanish under the Doppler filtering of the formidable Nebo-M radar, pushing them into a terrain-hugging zone where that sophisticated system became functionally blind to low-velocity objects. There were no pilots inside the trucks. The operation was utterly remote, a cold, automated strike. At a precise second, a single encrypted burst hit a hidden Starlink terminal, and the roof of each container slid open silently on hydraulic rails. Then, 18 Shrike drones lifted into the freezing fog, their electric motors purring softly, a predatory sound swallowed by the vast, cold forest. They hovered in a moment of perfect, lethal formation before splitting instantly into pre-assigned attack lines. For 6 full minutes, Russia registered nothing. Then, a faint anomaly flashed on a Nebo M screen, a ghost of movement. At the nearby Panzer S1 command unit, an operator saw what the automated filters were programmed to ignore. 6 fast-moving, low-flying objects, too organized to be birds, too slow to be anything conventional. Russian doctrine, hardened over decades, reacted with reflexive violence. Use overwhelming force first. Ask questions later. 257 E-6 missiles screamed upward at Mach 3, their impact destroying 2 faint radar returns instantly in brilliant, wasteful fireballs. On paper, it was a perfect kill. In reality, Russia had just spent over $20,000 neutralizing what were, in fact, cheap decoys. A brutal, lopsided exchange rate that was only the preamble to the trap. Believing the threat neutralized, Ground Command executed the next predictable step, deploying 2 Ural 4,320 trucks to hunt down a non-existent sabotage team. They were sent combing the dark, snow-covered tree lines, chasing shadows and phantoms that were not there. While these units were utterly diverted, the remaining 16 Shrikes slipped deeper into Russian territory, their advance masked by the very chaos they had created. At 2:38 a.m., the illusion of calm shattered completely. A French-made Thalys jamming system struck the Panzer's radar with a focused, concentrated burst of electronic noise, instantly turning every screen into a blizzard of static. At that precise, critical moment, Russia's own environment became Ukraine's lethal ally. The 28 Dies Circ F air was suffocating the lithium-ion batteries inside the Panzer's electronic suite, cutting output by a crippling 25%. Turret motors that should have snapped into position with instantaneous precision now rotated with the sluggish, agonizing crawl of thawing metal. Operators stared at their equipment, half-blind and freezing, unsure if they were fighting drones or ghosts. But Russia's layered surveillance network was not reliant only on ground systems. Circling far above at 30,000 feet, the A-50 AWACS, its massive dome sweeping the horizon, was hunting. It wasn't tracking radar-reflective objects now, it was hunting for the pure, undeniable reality of heat. Against the vast frozen landscape, 3 glowing anomalies appeared. The logging trucks, their engines radiating a definite $160 circ Fahrenheit against the icy terrain. The thermal blankets had fooled local patrols, but the eye in the sky of that caliber saw straight through the camouflage. Coordinates streamed instantly to the command center, and a senior officer issued the fatal order. Capture them alive. I want proof. 2 K-52 Alligator helicopters launched, their rotors beating the air like hammers of doom, their millimeter-wave radar scanning the tree cover, forming ghostly thermal silhouettes of everything below. Behind them, an Mi-8 transport helicopter carried 6 Spetsnaz soldiers and 2 trained dogs, ready to seize the Ukrainian operators and parade them in Moscow as irrefutable evidence of foreign sabotage. Inside the lead truck, the Ukrainian operators watched their mission clock tick down, the drones only minutes from the edge of their battery life. Then came the unmistakable growing sound of helicopter rotors closing in, the breath of the predator. When the driver attempted to accelerate, the wheels spun helplessly. They had backed the multi-ton vehicle into a snowdrift, immobilizing it. For most missions, this would have been the ignominious end. For this mission, it was Phase 2. A single command triggered a system in the third truck, positioned a mile and a half away. That decoy truck ignited, its engine heat simulated by a 12-volt heater wired to mimic the precise, deadly thermal signature of a hot diesel engine. The K-52 pilots saw the glow. In the cold forest, heat meant life. It meant their target. And they veered instantly toward the hottest signature. The real operators climbed into a UAZ Hunter that had been intentionally left outside overnight. Its engine block was as cold as the snow around it, making it thermally invisible. They loaded their control gear and sped down a narrow logging trail known only to the locals. From the back of the moving UAZ, tethered by a 15-foot fiber optic cable, they launched the final devastating wave of drones. Meanwhile, when the Spetsnaz fast-roped onto the decoy truck, they found nothing but a heater, a GPS spoofer, and a USB stick looping a defiant Ukrainian folk remix, the only tangible evidence of their ghost enemy. 5 miles away, the real strike unfolded with silent, deadly efficiency. At 2:45 a.m., a Shrike drone locked onto the geometric center of Transformer 2. Using an M732 fuse timed to detonate 0.8 seconds after penetration, it punched clean through the casing before exploding. The concrete walls of the substation acted as a pressure chamber. 2 pounds of TNT became a shock wave multiplied by the cold density of the air. The internal columns vaporized, the roof collapsed, and the substation died instantly. An orbiting US satellite captured the entire sequence. 3 intact trucks, then Russian helicopters chasing the wrong heat source, and finally, an 80-foot crater where the substation once stood. This was not just an explosion, it was a statement, carved into the frozen earth of Belgorod. Ukraine had successfully inverted the power dynamic, proving that in the modern age, agility, intelligence, and the ruthless application of physics could dismantle the monolithic strength of a superpower. But as the smoke cleared over the ruins of the substation, the night was far from over. The success at Belgorod was merely the first hammer blow, and deep in the command centers of Kiev, the Windweaver cascade was already being initialized for a target even further, even deadlier, and even more impossible to reach. If the strike on Belgorod was a surgical incision, the assault on the Vesha substation was a ghost story written in radar static and freezing wind. Hours after the first tower of fire had signaled the end of Russia's rearguard complacency, a new, terrifying anomaly began to bleed onto the screens of air defense operators monitoring the Volga region. They saw faint, drifting clusters of signal noise and, in a fatal lapse of judgment born of exhaustion and disbelief, dismissed them as dense snow clouds rolling in from the steppe. This was the psychological blind spot Ukraine had banked on, the assumption that the impossible remains impossible. They were wrong. What the operators were ignoring were Ukrainian Loity drones, lethally quiet machines carrying 130-pound payloads of C4, streaking toward a $200 million node, responsible for pushing 2.4 million kilowatts into the industrial heart of the Russian grid. But the mission was mathematically doomed from the start. The drones had a hard operational ceiling of 620 miles, yet Vesha sat 710 miles away. In any conventional war, the drones would have fallen from the sky, their batteries dead, 90 miles short of the target. But this was not a conventional war. Ukraine had initialized the Windweaver cascade, a flight algorithm that bordered on sorcery. The lead drone began exhaling a calculated aerosol mist, merging 5 distinct radar returns into a single, amorphous cloud that drifted rather than flew. As fuel reserves critically dipped, the AI pilot stopped fighting the 35.5 mph crosswinds and instead surrendered to them, tucking the aircraft into thermal updrafts and riding the currents like a predatory bird. Efficiency spiked by 30%, and the impossible distance suddenly collapsed into a terrifying reality. The illusion of safety over the Volga shattered at 1:47 a.m., when a Russian 57E6 missile, launched in a panic, tore through the aerosol cloud, destroying 1 drone in a violent burst of shrapnel. 4 remained. In a maneuver that defied the inertia of standard flight dynamics, the survivors executed a synchronized 90-degree turn, reducing their radial velocity relative to the ground radar to near zero. To the Doppler systems hunting them, which rely on movement toward or away from the sensor to detect targets, the drones simply ceased to exist, vanishing into the background noise of the frozen earth. But Russia had one final card to play, a card that should have been trump. High in the stratosphere, the A-50 AWACS was circling, its massive sensors immune to radar tricks because it was hunting heat. It saw the 200 circular Fahrenheit signatures of the drone engines burning against the sub-zero landscape like flares in a dark room. A missile locked onto the lead drone, Pathfinder, with an infrared seeker that could not be bargained with. It was here that the war changed again. Pathfinder activated Winter Ghost mode. It ejected a chemical pod that ignited instantly, burning at the exact same $200 some circa Fahrenheit as the engine, while the drone itself cut its throttle and glided into the black silence. The missile's seeker, presented with two identical thermal truths, chose the decoy. As the pod disintegrated in a fireball, Pathfinder reignited its engine, climbing back into the sky like a spirit returning from the grave. The crew of the A-50 watched in paralyzed horror as a target they had just destroyed re-entered the battle space, defying the binary certainty of life and death. By 2:47 a.m., the final command from Kyiv arrived. A single digital pulse. Engage. The 4 remaining drones did not just crash. They executed a terminal velocity dive into the 500 kilovolt transmission lines, unleashing 600 pounds of C4. The true genius of the strike lay in the microscopic timing of the destruction. And $0.88 fuse delay allowed the warheads to penetrate deep inside the frozen metal joints before detonation. At 0 hours circa Fahrenheit, steel loses its ductility and behaves like glass. When the charges blew, the massive pylons didn't bend, they shattered. The cables snapped with the force of whiplash, and 500 megawatts of power vanished from the grid in a nanosecond. Flashes lit the horizon, and fires climbed 30 feet into the air, signaling the death of the energy network. The cascading failure was immediate and catastrophic. The cities of Ulanovsk, Mordovia, and Chuvashia plunged into a suffocating medieval darkness. But the blackout was not just civilian, it was strategic. Encrypted command networks went silent. Artillery batteries, blinded without power for their radar, ceased fire. T-90 tank convoys, dependent on electrified depots for fuel transfer and maintenance, stalled in the snow. A critical ammunition plant in Chuvashia ground to a halt for 72 hours, starving the front lines of shells. As Ukrainian forces advanced 5 miles near Zaporizhzhia, exploiting the chaos, a Russian commander was intercepted screaming into a dead radio. How did drones get this far? The answer was written in the cratered earth of Vesha. Ukraine had weaponized the winter, turning a heater into a decoy, wind into fuel, and distance into a weapon. They had proven that Russia's strategic depth was a myth, and in the freezing dark that followed, the realization set in that nowhere was safe. The operational paralysis that followed the twin strikes was absolute, a cascading system failure that spread through the Russian military infrastructure like gangrene. It wasn't just that the lights had gone out, it was that the nervous system of the occupying force had been severed. In the freezing dark, artillery batteries along the front lines fell silent, their radar eyes blinded by the sudden loss of power, leaving them vulnerable to counter-battery fire they could no longer predict. T-90 tank convoys, massive beasts of steel that relied on electrified depots for maintenance and fuel transfer, stalled in the snow, transforming from instruments of terror into immobile sculptures of ice. The Chuvashia ammunition plant, a critical artery pumping shells to the offensive, flatlined for 72 hours, creating a supply void that allowed Ukrainian forces to surge forward 5 miles near Zaporizhzhia. In the command bunkers, the confusion was palpable, a mixture of rage and impotence. A Russian commander was intercepted over a dying frequency, his voice cracking with the strain of a reality he could not reconcile, shouting, "How did drones get this far?" The question hung in the air, unanswered by his subordinates, because the answer was too humiliating to admit. The answer was burning across the snow-covered forests, written in the charred remains of their most sophisticated defenses. Ukraine had not defeated them with superior tonnage or a larger air force. They had defeated them by weaponizing the very environment Russia claimed to master. They had turned winter itself into a munition, transforming a humble logging truck into a battlefield switchblade, a 12-volt heater into a decoy that fooled million-dollar helicopters, and the biting wind into a source of acceleration. They had taken the vast, freezing distance that Russia believed was its impenetrable shield and turned it into a highway for destruction. The strike challenged the most fundamental assumptions about the security of rear infrastructure, proving that in the age of AI and asymmetrical warfare, there is no such thing as a safe zone. The drone swarm, costing less than a single luxury car, had dismantled a defense network worth billions, enforcing a brutal economic exchange rate that no superpower can sustain indefinitely. The destruction of the substations was merely the physical manifestation of a deeper victory, the psychological shattering of the invaders' sense of invulnerability. As the generators failed and the cold began to creep into the barracks and command centers, the Russian military was forced to confront a terrifying new truth. The storm Ukraine unleashed was not just a momentary raid, it was a demonstration of a new era of warfare where ingenuity outpaces armor, where the garage defeats the military-industrial complex, and where the freezing dark is no longer a shelter for the occupier, but a weapon in the hands of those defending their home. The myth of the untouchable rear was gone, vaporized in the cold air, leaving behind only the silence of the snow and the dread of what would come next. The dawn that broke over the frozen expanse of the Volga revealed more than just twisted metal and scorched earth. It illuminated the wreckage of a military doctrine that had stood unchallenged since the Cold War. This was the death knell of the concept of the secure perimeter, ringing out in the silence of a grid gone dark. What Ukraine demonstrated in those few freezing hours was not merely a tactical victory, but a fundamental rewriting of the economics of survival. The asymmetry is terrifying in its clarity. A superpower hemorrhaging millions of dollars in advanced interceptor missiles to hunt down plastic and plywood, while the real threat slips through the cracks in the radar. A Mrejahida, riding the wind like a phantom. Every missile Russia fires at a decoy is a strategic defeat, a financial bleed that no oil reserve can stanch forever. The equation has flipped, and the math of war has become a nightmare for the occupier. The hunter has become the hunted, not by a larger predator, but by a swarm of stinging insects that refuse to die. The generals in Moscow are now forced to look at every snowdrift, every logging truck, and every drifting cloud with paranoid suspicion, knowing that the landscape itself has been recruited against them. The psychological toll of this persistent, invisible threat is heavier than any high-explosive payload because it erodes morale from the inside out, whispering to every radar operator that their screens are lying, and to every tank commander that their armor is nothing more than a cold iron coffin waiting to be sealed. The strike proved that in the modern theater, size is a liability, and stealth is the only currency that matters. The Iron Dome did not just fail. It was rendered irrelevant, bypassed by an enemy that thought in terms of algorithms and aerodynamics rather than brute force. As the technicians rush to repair the shattered pylons, welding steel that is still brittle from the cold, they are patching a wound that cannot heal because the weapon that inflicted it is still out there, evolving, learning, and waiting for the next moonless night. The drone wars have not just begun. They have reached a terrifying maturity, and the message sent from the ruins of Belgorod to the darkened streets of Chuvashia is unmistakable. There is no distance great enough, no winter cold enough, and no radar powerful enough to hide the truth that the age of the tank is ending, and the age of the swarm has arrived. The sky no longer belongs to the thunder of the jet engine. It belongs to the quiet electric hum of the inevitable. And for the Russian military machine, the long, freezing night has only just begun. As the smoke finally drifted across the desolate expanse of the Volga, it carried with it the ashes of certainty, marking the precise moment when the history of 21st century warfare pivoted on its axis. The destruction of the Vesha and Belgorod substations was not merely a logistical inconvenience or a temporary darkness. It was a terrifying manifesto, delivered in fire and silence. It declared that the era of monolithic military power, where victory is measured in tonnage and budget, is irrevocably over. Russia, a nation that prides itself on the brute strength of its armor and the depth of its strategic geography, found itself paralyzed by an adversary that possessed neither, but instead wielded the terrifying power of adaptability. The irony is Shakespearean in its tragedy. The very winter that stopped Napoleon and Hitler, the freezing cold that Russia has historically claimed as its oldest and most loyal ally, has defected. Ukraine did not just fight the Russian military. They recruited the Russian climate, turning the sub-zero winds into a propulsion system and the biting frost into a saboteur that shattered steel like glass. This betrayal of the environment strikes a psychological blow deeper than any missile, for it suggests that the very land they occupy has turned against them. The frightening calculus of this new war is not defined by who has the most missiles, but by who can think faster, who can innovate cheaper, and who can turn a $500 consumer circuit board into a strategic asset that blinds a billion-dollar radar. The definitive lesson written in the craters of that night is that there is no longer such a thing as a safe rear area. The concept of the front line has been erased, replaced by a 360-degree battle space where a logging truck, a drifting cloud, or a snowdrift could be the harbinger of destruction. Generals in Moscow are left staring at maps that no longer make sense, realizing that their air defense domes are full of holes large enough to drive a revolution through. The security they purchased with oil billions was dismantled by code written in a basement and drones built on a workbench. This is the democratization of air superiority, a shift so profound that it renders traditional notions of superpower, deterrence, obsolete. As the lights flicker back on in the frozen cities of the Volga, the fear remains, a cold current running beneath the surface of daily life. The silence of the snow is no longer peaceful. It is pregnant with threat. The drone operators in Ukraine have proven that they can reach out and touch the beating heart of the Russian economy at will. And next time, they may not stop at the power grid. The storm that began with a simple tower of fire in Belgorod has not passed. It has merely paused to reload. The long, comfortable illusion of invulnerability has been shattered, and in the freezing dark that follows, the world watches with bated breath as the underdog continues to rewrite the laws of physics, war, and survival. The night belongs to the silent, and the silence is deafening.